Welcome everyone to today's webinar where we're going to be discovering Microsoft Copilot Automation and Scripting Essentials. And what does that mean? That actually means Copilot Studio and some other studios that we can use alongside our AI solution here. I am joined here with Richard Swaysgood, our Director of Microsoft Professional Services, and I am Jeff Lizerbaum, Pre-Sales Solutions Architect. What we're going to be covering today, in no particular order, and for others who have joined our webinars in the past, we kind of go free form in a lot of this because Copilot and AI are things that are constantly changing, and there's always new information that comes to us, sometimes at the last moment here. So we're going to be sharing with you some really up-to-date information about Copilot Studio, Azure OpenAI Studio, and other things. We're actually going to build a chatbot, and so you can see how that's going to look and feel and give you some ideas of how you might want to build something yourself. Now, alongside that, there's always possibilities for further innovation and automation as these things are constantly changing. And throughout the webinar, we're going to show you some other demonstrations embedded throughout this presentation. And finally, questions and answers. You're going to be able to come off of mute, or you can post your Q&A, your question and answer, by hitting that button in Zoom, and go ahead and ask away your questions, and we'll be able to respond to you during the presentation. And immediately following our presentation, we're going to take these questions live on the air. Well, let's get after it. Well, before we dive deep into our presentation here, let's take a step back, because the first thing that lots of our customers ask for is, I want AI. I want AI. What does that mean? Well, it can mean lots of things, but we have to actually take a step back and understand, first off, what are your organization's goals for using AI? What are those business outcomes? What are you trying to achieve there? Start there. We also have to address the organization's pain points. What can AI address that's going to make things a little bit easier, more efficient? Ask those questions. You might also want to think about, what are your current capabilities of AI? You might already be using some form or fashion of artificial intelligence, but let's find out. Let's dig a little bit further into your current capabilities. Now, very important, does your organization have a strategy in place? Ask yourself that, because data strategy is utmost importance before you really start thinking about your goals and business outcomes. And the thing is that it requires a good infrastructure and resources to support AI initiatives. Now, a lot of this infrastructure is cloud-based, of course, but we also want to perhaps look at data that might be residing on premises, and also look at the resources and skill sets that you might have within your organization that can support this long term. Just to review, we follow the 6 C's, and I want to make sure that this is embedded with everyone, because this is the strategy that your organization is going to require so that you can make sure your data strategy is safe and ready before your AI implementation. Now, a common thing that happens when you are embarking on a journey of using AI, we're going to use AI Studio in some form or fashion, but which one? There are actually quite a few right now that have been developed, and some of them are awesome. I mean, there's Azure OpenAI Studio, which is probably going to be used in the case where we're going to tie together Azure OpenAI along with Microsoft Copilot Studio. And so there's a lot of capabilities in terms of how to create your deployments, your models, your generative AI. Even if you wanted to do some image integration there are lots of ways to do it within the Azure OpenAI Studio. But another studio comes with Teams. And within Teams, there is Copilot Studio. It used to come from Power Virtual Agent, and it's been rebranded. And this is a really great tool if you want to start creating chatbots within Teams. Now, Copilot Studio on the web is yet another console, and while they look a lot alike, they actually have slightly different functionalities that you'll see throughout this presentation. Now, to tie it all together, Microsoft has developed another AI studio, and that is the Azure AI Studio Preview. Now, you can have access to this now. You can poke around into it to see how it works, but really the intention is to make it a single pane of glass so it ties Copilot Studio on the web, Copilot Studio in Teams, and Azure OpenAI Studio, the more traditional one, all together so that you have one place to really develop your initiatives here. Before I pass it over to Richard, I wanted to talk about all of these Copilot Studios and AI Studio interfaces and really what they have in common with each other. All of them do some form of query rewriting, content retrieval, and summarization in order to get generative answers and responses that are going to suit your business needs. Now, depending on how rich you want that generative answer response to happen or how automated you want the response to happen, it's going to really kind of depend on what tool set you use and especially where you're going to retrieve the content. Public data in Bing is one of the things that Copilot Studio already includes. You might be also looking at SharePoint internal data in order to have generative AI create answers and responses. But one thing I wanted to show here was Azure OpenAI on your data. This is where you might use a combination of Copilot Studio and Azure OpenAI Studio to piece things together, and we're going to show you that. There's also uploaded documents and some custom data that can be passed on to your chatbot or process, whatever the case might be. One of the biggest questions, though, that comes up is, how much is this going to cost? I mean, this is a consumption-based model for the most part, and sure, there's Copilot licensing that might go along with it more on a fixed month-to-month license. But in terms of using something in the vast space of Azure OpenAI, how is this going to relate in terms of what I'm paying for in my operational expenses? And with that, here's Richard to hopefully shed some light on that.
So for the people that may not necessarily know, Copilot Studio comes with some generative AI features built in. I think it's like a $200 license, depending on the use case or some kind of free usage. But for Azure OpenAI, it's based on consumption. There's some upcoming like prepaid kind of things that you can kind of do, but just to kind of simplify things, you generally pay per token. The model designates how much the token costs, and they're usually sold in bulks of 1,000. So I think for the standard chat GPT 3.5, I think it's, what is it, 0.002? So a fifth of a cent for 1,000 tokens.
Sounds like a deal.
Yeah. And so you may potentially ask yourself, what exactly is a token, right? So is a token a full message? Is it? It's not. A token is generally up to about 4 characters. So if you think of, the prompt that Jeff put in, that I'm traveling to New York in the first message the week of May, could be maybe anywhere from about 30 to 52 tokens. So kind of keep that in mind. I think I have a nice little website that I like to go to that sort of visualizes that OpenAI has on how those tokens work.
Yeah, Richard, I think the help article that you're referencing is at help.openai.com, which talks about what are tokens and how to count them. And I'm going to post it in a QR code so that our attendees can take a look at that on their own.
It's a nice kind of like visual. And so here, for example, we can go in, and I'm just going to go ahead and just kind of grab one of these copies right here. Just copy this. And so this is super high level how some of these tokens are kind of broken out. That's ultimately how a lot of this kind of consumption kind of works. So if I go in and I go into the little tokenizer tool that OpenAI has on their website, and I go, chat GPT 3.5 or 4, I put the text in, and then you can see how it breaks it up into the different tokens. So you can see each one of these colored items is a different token. As you can see, something that is in essence just a quick little kind of couple sentence in here gets turned into 58 tokens. And the consumption is also based on the response, right? So if you ask a couple questions and then that comes back, then the response is also going to be in tokens, and you, in essence, also get charged for that. So keep that in mind. And then I mentioned earlier about clearing that chat. When sent over to ChatGPT, a lot of that information gets put together to provide sort of the history of the chat, the context of the chat. And so depending on how many different questions you are potentially kind of asking, you can run into particularly large kind of tokenization. So, first question, 58 tokens, and then the response back is another 58. Then the next question includes the context of the original question plus the new question. So that could be, 110 tokens and so forth and so forth. I did some calculations. For example, my ChatGPT usage is about $2. I did the math. So I know
are you saying it's
Are you
saying it's $2 per
month? Per month. Yeah, I did the math on the ChatGPT 4 with the turbo with the extra large tokens, because there's the token limits, like the responses can go up to like 16K or something tokens, and that's I think 6 cents per 1,000 tokens. And so then I looked at how much my average ChatGPT usage is from the Copilot Studio reports, and then I kind of figured out the math on how much I do per month, and so my usage is $2 per month, give or take.
Got it. But that's based on one user.
One user, yes. That's just one user. I am a pretty heavy user, so I'm probably a little bit higher than an average person. But definitely, think a little bit about that when deciding to use the Azure OpenAI. There is quotas when you provision the model. I don't know if you kind of want to show them. It's like right there in the little, when you collect the I think in the Azure OpenAI, there's an ability for you to set quotas.
Let me share my screen here.
Yeah, and so then that way you can, potentially control a little bit of cost, especially as you're kind of developing and trying to understand how some of these kind of bits and pieces work. I think it's in their quotas. And so there's default quota, so you can see how many tokens per minute you can use. Again, sort of do the math there. If you're being charged for, 1,000 tokens is, 2 cents. And try to kind of work the math behind that. And you can set different quotas for different models, right? And so that allows you to kind of control costs a little bit, because you never know. You might all of a sudden get a huge influx of users, especially for anyone that's planning on having a chatbot be public facing. That could potentially, you might all of a sudden get 10,000 users using your chatbot. And so, definitely be aware of the costs associated with that, and keep an eye on your quotas, and kind of help understand a little bit like that. And especially anything that's public facing, it's really hard for you to control and measure how your customers might potentially use that. And so definitely go in there and maybe go in some of the capacity calculators and kind of model some of the different costs. Yeah, things to definitely think about when planning on going live, internally, and as well, especially externally. Like if you're going to put this chatbot on a public website, without any authentication, without any controls, definitely consider. Because of that, I recommend doing a little bit of testing and maybe have some method to, maybe bring the chatbot offline, or potentially to go in and pre-allocate some Azure spending on that to sort of model the different ways. So there isn't any surprises. I'm sure everyone's played around with either AWS and Azure, and then all of a sudden cost got a little bit away from them. So definitely use those quotas whenever possible. Sometimes when you're kind of deep in working things, you may not necessarily how much you're consuming. So use those quotas, and then the subscription is still limited to the overall quotas that you set. And so, go into the Azure subscription itself and get that, the cost management deployed. So then that way, if you have a total limit, you can go ahead and not get surprised with, $1,000 or something when you're anticipating $200 of spend.
Yep. And look at this. You can always go outside to request more quota if you
Mhm,
need it. Give your reasons why, information. So,
mhm.
yeah.
Yeah, I think for most internal users, it's not going to be that big of an issue. Internal usage. Really, the only scenarios where I can think this might potentially have some issues is if it's a public-facing bot, just because the internet being the internet.
Yes.
You don't want to be subject of a DDoS or something because you have a ChatGPT bot.
All right, the moment you've all been waiting for, we're going to actually start building a Teams chatbot, and we're going to be using Copilot Studio and Azure OpenAI Studio, among some other interfaces. Now, it's important to understand before we get started is that this is just the basic building blocks of an internal Teams chatbot. You might be building something of your own that fulfills a different business need. It's important also to follow the 6 C's to make sure your data is in compliance and conditioned. And you're going to see a lot of different interfaces, including OpenAI, OpenAI Studio, Azure Search, things like that, and how all of these things work together. So let's start by going to your Azure instance, portal.azure.com, and I'm going to open up the Azure AI services. Now, when I go into the Azure AI services, the first thing is to create a resource. And sometimes, depending on your subscription, you might not be able to see or have access to build that resource just yet because you have to get permission from Microsoft. So for that, there is a form. There's going to be a link in your Azure AI instance to bring you to the latest form, and it's important to fill out all the information about how are you going to be using it. In fact, there's a section down here below in terms of, how are you going to apply authentication? Are you using it internally? Are you using it externally? And also, what other workloads are you going to bring in the usage of artificial intelligence? So some of these things, try to fill that out as detailed as possible, and it usually takes about 24 hours to get a turnaround and approval. But once that's done, we can go right back into the Azure OpenAI, and we can go ahead and create our first OpenAI instance here. Now, your subscription will be listed. If you already have a resource group, you can utilize that. I do in this case. And we go through and select the region, the name, and the pricing tier. Now, the regions, some of them have different characteristics and different services. So it's important to research, depending on what you want to do, what region you want to spin up your Azure OpenAI instance. Now you can see it's a pretty easy process. I'm just going to go click next, next, and create, and it's going to create it in just a few moments here. So now that I have the resource created, one thing to point out is that you have keys and endpoints that are associated with your Azure OpenAI instance. We're going to come to this later, but it's important to understand what that endpoint is. Now, what we'll do is we're going to implement AI search. Now, this is not a mandatory thing you have to do, but if you want to search on data that you own, this might be one way of fulfilling that. So what search does, it's going to set up another resource account, and we're going to have that opportunity to select, first of all, what resource tier should we be choosing, what pricing tier, because it depends on how much data that you have. So keep in mind, Azure AI Search, it can be expensive depending on how much data is going to be used. But let's go ahead and we're going to select our tier, and we're going to create this resource right here. All right, and in just a few moments, that deployment will be complete. And what we can do is let's go to the resource, and we're going to import our data. So in this example, let's say there's a database that we have, whether it's sitting in Azure, maybe there's an on-premises SQL database. we can go ahead and choose the data source, and here I'll go select from a sample. Now, what's kind of cool about this is that if you want to get your feet wet, you can always use the sample databases here to practice your AI chops. So I'm going to just do that, and I'm going to just take a look around here for any other settings. I don't think I need to set anything else here, and we're going to skip right to the customize target index, and you can customize what the indexer is going to do. We can check boxes for what will be filtered or sortable or things like that. And then we can go ahead and finish off and submit that AI search instance and our data import. So I'll go ahead and submit that, and in a moment that will be created, and now we have our data that we're going to bring in into our chatbot. Okay, so at this point, so now I've got my Azure AI instance, I've got my search instance, and now we're going to move on into Copilot Studio. So let's mosey on over to the Teams Copilot Studio, and this is specifically the Teams Copilot Studio, not the one that is on the web, but this is the one that would be embedded into Teams. And we're going to start by allocating a team site. It's important to do that where you want to stage your Copilot chatbot. And let's go ahead and give it a name. I'm going to call this Soulmate again, based off of the Azure OpenAI instance. And English will be the language, and we'll go ahead and select an icon. I've already created an icon that I like to use. And I'm speeding this up because it does take some time for that Copilot Studio to get generated. All right, we're going to flip over to Azure OpenAI Studio at this point, and I am going to use my resource that I created over in Azure OpenAI Service. Now, when we use the resource, we're going to create a deployment model, and for this case, I'm going to choose 3.5 Turbo. So I'm going to give it a deployment name here. And now that it's deployed, we can actually go into the deployment and the playground. So let's go in, let's open up the deployment, and we have to find the playground, which is right here. Kind of a fun place to be, the playground. And right away, I can go ahead and start testing it out. Now, I am typing a question. It's giving me a response. And that's the first step, just to make sure that it's working. But there's a few other things we can do here as well. There's things called templates within Azure OpenAI, and if you want to give it a little personality, there are already built templates for whatever you're looking to do. Now, if you don't like any of those, you could always use the default, and we can actually generate our own template over here. Now let me show you some of the areas where we can do that. If you click on parameters on the right, configuration, you're going to see a bunch of slider bars here. The temperature bar and the top P bar, these are what are going to give it more personality. Now, the more personality warmth that you give it, you kind of have to be careful because it might not provide the correct answers and it might not be as accurate, but it's going to certainly give you a lot more randomness and a lot more human-like behavior in the responses. Pretty interesting on how this interface here, as opposed to Copilot Studio, I think it's a little bit lighter on some of these fine-tuning characteristics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think Copilot Studio has what is it, three main options so far. I know they had in preview a tone for a while, and it looks like it's been replaced by a guidance section. So if you go into Copilot Studio and you go under, I think it's under settings, you can see some of the other kind of bits and pieces. Under, I think it's under, is it generative AI? I think.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Yeah, so you can see how if you kind of scroll down, you can see Copilot content moderation, and it says hi, which
Yes.
is it's a little bit like the temperature, but it's instead of being sort of very fine-tuned, you have the three main options. And then scroll all the way to the bottom. There's a little section that they've added. So before, under right where instruction was, it was an option for you to specify sort of the tone, and they had a couple of kind of different tones for your chatbot. And so that looks like that's been replaced by a preview feature that allows you to kind of describe a little bit of how the chatbot. So if you look at some of those prompts where, I think if you go into the Azure AI, the prompt studio, which I don't know if you've necessarily been in there before.
Oh, no.
So if you go back into the Azure, there's a little place, because we've been kind of focusing a lot on how to get that infrastructure kind of up and running. Completions, I think is the terminology here. Sorry, I've been using the Azure AI Hub because that's currently in preview. And so then from here, you can start creating custom prompts, right? So for example, let's say you find that your users are constantly asking for the hotel thing. Let's say we graph the hotel thing, right? So what you can do is you can build out a prompt that has that information. And so when a user request the hotel information, you can kind of parse the information and then add it into a completely custom prompt that you want. And so you can include that as part of your kind of deployment, if that makes any sense. So for example, maybe you want, let's say, for example, you wanted to add a function where a user summarizes an article or anything like that. This is where you would go in and sort of do that.
Well, thanks, Richard. That's a good explanation between the difference of Copilot Studio and the Azure OpenAI. Let's draw our attention back to AI Studio. Now, over here, I can go ahead and add the data. And remember, we created our Azure AI search. Let's go ahead and select that. Let's go ahead and get our subscription selected, and you'll see right away it shows my AI search service that I've created, and it also has the index that I could drop down and select. There's my database, and we're going to hit next, and I think we're good to go here. Not too many other choices here. I can only search by keyword in this instance, but I'll go ahead and save and close. And officially now, I have my data that has been entered that I can utilize Azure OpenAI. And there's a couple other slider bars here in terms of how you want to limit the responses or how flexible or strict that you would like it to be. Now let's go ahead. I am going to prompt it with another question. Let's just double check the answer here. And now that it's generated some answers, I can show you a couple things here on the scripting piece. If you show the JSON code, you can see how the JSON code is put together, but you could also view the code that was actually generated. And there's a few different code languages of your choice. If you like JSON, if you like Python or curl. Now I like curl because right at the top there, I can select the endpoint. Now, if you remember, in my Azure OpenAI instance, we had endpoints and API keys. This is where you're going to grab the endpoint, and we're actually going to use this in the next step to build out our chatbot. So here I am, back into the Teams Copilot Studio. We're going to make some final touches and final modifications here to make it come alive. So let's start off with trigger phrases. Trigger phrases are things that are going to prompt the chatbot to come alive. So I'm just putting in a few trigger phrases there, and I'm going to add the question. So this is how the chatbot is going to respond back. If you think about it, it's kind of like putting together a movie script. So this is, in a fashion, this is a script in terms of how it's going to start and be triggered and how it's going to respond. Now, when I want my user to put an input into the chatbot, I want it to go out to my Azure OpenAI to get a richer response. And this is how we do it. We actually go through what's known as the Power Virtual Agent flow templates. So we could actually call an action and create some Power Virtual Agents behind the scenes here. And here I'm defining my user input variable. And in the next step, this one's the most important one, I'm going to go ahead and call up an HTTP post. And as you can see in the URI, I've got my endpoint listed and I have my API key listed. And this is the JSON that I actually copied and brought over. And all we're doing here is we're cleaning it up and we're putting in some variables on the user input so that what's happening is as the user inputs, it's going to go out to Azure OpenAI. It's going to ask GPT and my database information to get back the response. Now, just taking a pause here, I wanted to mention that Power Virtual Agents have a lot of elements. There's a lot you can do, but the main purpose was to show how we can reach out to our Azure OpenAI instance to be able to get to my database, to my Azure AI search. And now what we're going to do is we're going to close off the script. So let's go ahead and show a message. And I can say, well, here's what I found. And we're going to do another call, not a call to action, but we're going to end the conversation with the survey. And let's go ahead and give it that survey and we'll save that and we're going to test it. All right, here's the trigger. And you can see how on the right side, how the scripting is responding. The next step is publishing. And when you publish it, you want to give it some details. You want to give it the developer name, put in the website and privacy statements and terms of use and things like that, just to make your chatbot official. And it's part of making AI responsible for your organization. So let's go ahead and finish off the description, and we are going to add it to Teams and make it available within the organization. And here's the result. Now I'm in Teams and I've got my Soulmate chatbot and I'm going to ask it a question. Here's the trigger. Comes back, asks me the question, how can I help you? And tell me a quick history of managed solution, and it will give me that response back. So I could see that it's working, and that's it in a nutshell. I realized it went really fast. I encourage you to review this if you want to start those initial building blocks yourself to build up a chatbot that might be related a little bit more relevant for your company. Well, next we're going to shift gears and show you some of the nuances with the new Azure AI Studio preview. Richard, give us a tour.
And so here, we can see I've kind of built out a couple projects in here. This is sort of the new upcoming homepage for a lot of the stuff that you'll be doing in the future. It's all preview, so that's probably why we haven't necessarily covered it too much. But from here, you can go in and you can kind of provision new projects, provision it to various different resources. And so in this case, I have a pre-existing project, and you can see the new playground looks a little different.
It certainly does.
Yeah, and I've had a couple clients that they were sort of going through that journey of setting this up and got completely and utterly confused because all the videos reference what you've been showing recently. And so definitely be on the lookout. Microsoft is in the process of launching the Azure AI Studio, which is sort of a unified for all the different things. So you can see how to connect your data is it's kind of the same experience, but it's sort of a little bit, I guess maybe it's a little nicer, maybe, I don't know. But yeah, if you do get, definitely be cognizant of the two different studios and, look at the ai.azure.com is the new one.
And the only difference is that the old one is OAI, so I guess you could call that the old AI.azure.com.
Yeah, and so then a lot of the features that are in there are in here, right? So for example, here's the chat playground, and so you can go in, everything's just kind of a little bit different. So you can create a new that. Let's do a new real-time endpoint. it's the same thing, just different. So keep that in mind. Eventually, Microsoft will flip out the two once they kind of get them up to feature set, but keep that in mind. And this is the prompt flow thing that I was kind of referring to. So you can go ahead and do like a chat flow. And then here is where you can kind of build out various different prompts that then can be used to add to your pre-existing chatbots as part of a flow.
Yeah, right away I could tell. Right away I could tell that this looks. First of all, it's easier on the eyes, and it just looks like the workflow is easier as well. So I'm glad they're constantly making improvements. I mean, this area is moving so fast that what we show you today is going to change tomorrow. It seems like.
Yeah, but it's still the same thing. It looks a little different. Definitely a lot more rounded edges, a little bit more colorful thing.
Right.
But this is nice. And then furthermore, there's also what's referred to the Azure AI Hub. And so from here, you can see the various different components that you're giving in a project. So that's sort of the big difference between some of the other kind of bits and pieces. It allows you to very quickly spin up projects and then control permissions, which is sort of the main thing here. So for example, right now, if you're managing various different Azure OpenAI resource groups, if you're doing these kind of models, then they're in essence however you built them out. So if you haven't necessarily tied, let's say, your Azure AI search into the same resource group, if maybe you kind of did sort of a bad practice of kind of breaking them up, you might have to go into a bunch of different places and sort of control the permissions. And so the Azure AI Hub is a way for you to go in and manage all that. So here you can see all the various AI services I have. I can see my Azure OpenAI instance, the various blob storages that I have, all the various, who I've granted access. So if I were to go in and give access to, let's make you a contributor, Jeff.
Thank you.
And so, here you can have sort of a centralized thing to kind of manage all these kind of different works. And then you can go in, and this is a resource group. Then I go into view in Azure portal. And then you can still, it's just sort of a way to manage things at a higher level than having to individually manage all the various different components here. So you can say it's still a standard AI, but and then I can click in here, and then the new playgrounds, how to evaluate the different kind of bits and pieces, how to do the fine tuning, which is a very region specific feature right now.
This is how they're trying to condense and really kind of collapse all of these different studios into a common place, and I see what's happening there.
So you don't necessarily have to go into a couple different Azure regions. So that's really the purpose of this. Definitely be on the lookout when you're setting up your Azure OpenAI instance. This is preview, and so it may not necessarily work as expected. But definitely keep that in mind. And then you can always go in and just go through the Azure portal and just get this is fully compatible with the Azure OpenAI.
Well, thank you, Richard, for taking us through the AI Studio and especially all the nuances with the previews of the latest studios that are out there. At this point, we're going to take a step back, and I know that many of you who are still with us and following along are probably thinking, do I really need to use all of the AI Studio and AI search capabilities there? It's kind of a lot. Well, it is a lot, but if you're looking to just do, say, like a public chatbot demonstration or a public chatbot for your website, well, this is the time we're going to show you how to do just that. And for this demonstration, we're simply going to be in Copilot Studio on the web. That's the only Copilot Studio that we're going to be focusing on in this demonstration. This demonstration is going to show how to create a publicly facing chatbot embedded on a website. Let's go to copilotstudio.microsoft.com and we will start creating it. So the name I'm going to give it here is called Eugene. Let's give it a little name for some personality. And what we're going to do also is we're going to start with a website. So this will prompt at first to enter a website where it's going to perform some searching on data. In this example, I'm going to pull up a financial website, let's say for sake of demonstration, this is a website of my organization that I wanted to do some searching and indexing. When we create it, it's going to take some time. I am speeding up this video just for sake of time, but the Copilot in the initial state will be provisioned. The next step is we want to edit some Copilot details. And just for a little fun, let's change the icon. You can generate your own images using DALL-E 3 if you want, or find an icon that suits your purpose there. Now, the next step is we will go into the settings, and let's move on to generative AI. Generative AI is the area where we are going to select the sources where we want to have that data pull from, but I'm also going to add some PDF documents of my own. So this is an example of saying maybe I have a financial PDF document that I also want to include in the generative AI search. You'll see that the indexing is happening as the document is being uploaded, so it's indexing it for search purposes for Copilot. I'll speed it up. It does take some time, but it will show that it's ready. So at this point, we can actually start testing it out. So let's go ahead and test the Copilot by asking it a question. And the results that it comes back with is that it's pulling information and it's actually citating information from where it found the answer. So that's kind of cool. You can actually have it citate and pull that information from where it was showing the response. Another thing that we can do in generative AI is give it a little bit of a mood. And what I mean by this is content moderation. We can have it give us strict answers back. We can make it medium in terms of content moderation or low, but medium and low often generate answers that might not be correct, so choose it appropriately for how you want to tune the moderation. Now we're going to test it again, and this time I want to show you on the right-hand side of the flow that's happening while it's gathering that information. So again, it's citating, I'm testing it out, it's getting the responses, and you can see that it went through the conditions and the flow that it generated automatically. So what's neat about this is that Copilot Studio created a script based on the input that I gave it and the output that it delivered back to me. And if I wanted to modify that script a little bit more, we do have that ability to go in, and if we want to do things such as calling an action, calling it outside to an external Power Automate flow, and if we wanted to, say, add some actions to really kind of do whatever is intended for the business outcome, from approvals to another AI builder, or if you're looking to send email, there's a lot of automation that could be built in into these flows here. So it's really kind of neat how it's automated, and it includes things such as calling an action to Power Automate. So Copilot Studio is pretty flexible in terms of the type of scripting that you can do and perform. So now we're at the final point of publishing it. Now when you publish it, you can go ahead, hit that publish button, and eventually it'll say your published Copilot is good to go. Now there's a lot of different channels of where you could publish Copilot depending on how you want it to authenticate. For publishing it to a demo website, we're going to select demo website, and we can select how we want the welcome message and conversation starters to appear. And finally, we can test this out by going to the actual URL of the demo website. And this is how it would look perhaps on your website. You can embed the code, but we're going to go ahead and do a final test here, ask it a question, making sure that it gives us a proper response and that it's providing citations to where it's getting that information. And for the most part, that's it. That's a Copilot on a website in completion there. Well, we've come to the end of our webinar, but now's the time for you to ask your questions. And if you'd like, you can go ahead and hit the Q&A button and we'll answer your question that way. Or if you want to raise your hand, we'll take you off of mute and you can ask your question live. In the meantime, what I'll do, I'm going to post this image and this QR code up here so that if you have any questions after this webinar, feel free to scan this QR code. It'll bring us to our contact page here at Managed Solution, and one of our experts will reach out to help you out on your journey. All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining. Now's the time. If you wish to ask a question, you can do it through the Zoom Q&A, or if you want to raise your hand, we will take you off of mute and you can ask your question. While that's happening, I did want to call out that this QR code here, it'll bring you to really a place where if you want further information, it'll bring us to our contact page, and we'll reach out to you, to get coordinated with a meeting and start discussing any of your Copilot initiatives.
I think we have one question from Luis. To answer your question, and I'll click the little answer live. There is various different connectors between Power Automate, Microsoft Copilot Studio, and OpenAI. Copilot Studio, for example, has an option for you to either use the fallback or the topic and have that sent off specifically to your Azure OpenAI Studio kind of interface. Copilot Studio itself also has a lot of integrations with Power Automate. There's conversation plugins. If you're using Microsoft 365 Copilot, there's also some plugins there. You can also use a lot of the Power Automate extensions to sort of extend the functionality. To answer your question, there's all sorts of kind of integrations between the three services.
Awesome. Thank you, Richard. Just to cover some of the previously asked questions during the webinar, we got a question about, is there an example of using your own SharePoint as the LLM and asking a question? So the example that we gave was really fast. I realized that. But let's say if you're putting together a public chatbot and you're using copilotstudio.microsoft.com, well, the very first thing that it's going to prompt you to do is to actually enter in a URL where you want to retrieve the data. That URL could either be a publicly facing URL if you want, or it could actually be a SharePoint URL pointing to your data, and you can add additional URLs to get information from SharePoint. Just kind of keep in mind, making sure that SharePoint is well organized, well secured, well governed. Let's see, another question, just to double check, the recording will be available. So we will send out an email to all participants for the recording, but you can also find our previous webinars as well as this one will be published at managedsolution.com/events. And we also have some past recordings too in the Azure space too, Azure infrastructure from late last year.
Yeah, and to I guess piggyback on the SharePoint question, the default setting for the Copilot Studio, when you use a generative AI, you do have to configure Entra AD authentication. It's one of the options if you click on the security tab. Otherwise, your chatbot won't work. You'll probably get an error when you try to save it. It'll say something like authentication context hasn't been set up. So if you are trying to use a SharePoint site, you do have to go in and configure the security in the chatbot, which does require you to go in and do an Entra AD enterprise authentication. So there's a couple kind of setups, but ultimately what it's doing there is when the user accesses the chatbot, they have to sign in using their Entra AD, and that's how the chatbot determines what SharePoint documents and sites they have access to. So if a user doesn't have access to that SharePoint site that you're targeting, it won't work for them.
So that brings up a good question. So what if in the case that an organization wants to publicize a chatbot to the internet, but they will also want to grab content from SharePoint? Is there like any business to business authentication required?
Yeah, there's a lot of other sort of methods that you can kind of integrate the data. It just depends. But the default setting when you use the generative AI features is just based on the Entra AD authentication context. You can force the user to log in using a third-party SAML. So I know some of our clients have been using third-party SAML. When you go down the path of doing third-party SAML, or even Entra AD SAML, it doesn't necessarily use the context of the user. At that point, you would have to kind of build a flow that includes pulling in the Azure B2B or the Azure B2C identity, and then you kind of have to create the security matrices of what content and data you're sort of trying to give them access to. And so depending on the specific use case scenario, it might be easier to just use an Azure Blob Storage account. Again, I would have to kind of see what the use case scenario is. But sometimes it might just be easier to just do an Azure Blob Storage for specific topics, and then other topics you can grab the internal kind of SharePoint. Again, it just depends on how you're trying to authenticate.
Gotcha. Looks like we have another question from Augusto.
Yeah. So go ahead. I don't know if you want to answer that.
Well, I'll read the question in case people are just listening. But would you please provide a few use cases other than customer-facing chatbots, but rather for other uses, like for internal users?
Yeah, I mean, one of the use cases that I feel is a pretty common one is sort of like an onboarding chatbot. People that start within an organization tend to have a lot of questions. They may not necessarily be familiar. They don't know how to find different resources. And having a good onboarding process, I think that's still sort of critical to make sure that the new user knows where they need to go to get certain things. But having a chatbot can help reduce sort of the noise that might potentially happen when a new employee starts. I probably shouldn't call it noise, but all the questions that someone has, but they're like, hey, what does this mean? What does this other thing mean? And so having an internal chatbot that can answer those questions without necessarily having the user sort of be, what's the best way to kind of describe it? Not necessarily bothering someone else, but sometimes maybe a user may be hesitant to ask questions because they feel like they're being a bother, or maybe other people may not necessarily have the time to kind of find that information. And so having a chatbot that's connected to a lot of your internal stuff is useful for that purpose. Another common scenario is human resources related questions. That's something that I think a lot of human resources and in general communication groups within organizations have trouble. You send out email, you send out that memo, you send out all those different kind of communications, and people don't really read them. That's just unfortunately the reality of things. And so having a chatbot that can maybe handle those first line of questions, to be like, hey, I have this question, when is when are the company holidays? A pretty common scenario that a lot of companies kind of have, where HR keeps getting bugged with something that they've published 2 or 3 times. And so having a chatbot that can kind of handle that, and then when there is a question that maybe the chatbot itself can't necessarily answer, then there's a flow where it could be like, oh, okay, but we can give you the phone number of the person. And so it can be a way to kind of get the information that people need, because at the end of the day, those users do need that information, while at the same time alleviating all the different kind of ticky-tacky things that sometimes human resources or communication groups are dealing with.
Yeah. Another use case that I really see as well, because Copilot Studio and Azure AI and these things are integrated with Power Automate. You can actually, embed some Power Automate within the script that you're doing. So an example might be, if there's, say, you want to call up a certain automated process. Maybe it is to launch an email or launch a Word template or things like that. Those are some things that, really it will require some build and testing and piloting, of course, but, embedding some of the Power Automate within the Copilot script has a lot of use cases there internally.
Yeah, it's rather powerful. With the natural language processing is really really good. So if you've maybe in the past dealt with chatbots that felt a little kind of robotic, um, yeah, all the new ones with the ChatGPT integrations tend to work really really well, and they tend to be pretty good at summarization. I do also kind of want to call out that there is a specific product. So if you're maybe interested in getting a little bit more benefit from some of the ChatGPT services, Microsoft does have a product specifically built for Microsoft 365 called Microsoft 365 Copilot. I know sometimes with the kind of the chatbots, people kind of want to do potentially more, or maybe they want something that's already by default integrated with their Microsoft 365 content. And so if maybe you're not necessarily interested in creating a chatbot, but you want to see what generative AI services are just built within Microsoft 365, I do recommend going in and getting a Microsoft 365 Copilot license. I know some people think it's kind of pricey, but I personally think it's a pretty good kind of I don't know. I feel like the price is pretty good price point personally. But I do recommend spending some time because it can be a little difficult to learn and how to use. I see a lot of times when people get access to them, they tend to be a little kind of overwhelmed. And what can I do with this? What can I not do? But that could be another potential alternate avenue if you don't want to necessarily do like a Copilot Studio chatbot. You can use the generative chatbot features. And you'll notice that once you turn on the Copilot for Microsoft 365, the Copilot button will start showing up in Outlook and in PowerPoint and Excel in all sorts of services. And so then that's another alternate way where you can start using some of these AI services without necessarily having to do a lot of data connections or anything like that.
Awesome. Well, I think what we'll do, we're going to start wrapping it up. It looks like all the questions have been answered at this point. I do actually one other thing was it was posted that on Azure AI Studio, the Select Azure AI Search service might not be working, and Richard, you provided a response there, so hopefully that is helpful on those types of issues, especially if you're using the newer preview features of Azure OpenAI Studio. Yes, it looks like there's still development in the midst there. So, but other than that, we're going to wrap it up. But just a little reminder, we have Copilot offerings. Feel free to reach out to us via the QR code to get to our contact page. But there are a few Copilot offerings that we could provide and really kind of engage with you on whether it's a data readiness with Copilot, maybe it is building a bot like we showed you in this sample, or some other areas of interest. Feel free to reach out to us there. Well, with that said, we will end it here. We appreciate everyone for attending, and we will just be on the lookout for additional information from Managed Solution and Copilot. Thank you.